Welcome back, decathletes. Today I'm going to talk about foolish songs and ballads, something that I'm more familiar with, being a fool myself. So even though various types of religious music were prevalent in America from its earliest days, secular songs had been part of immigrants' previous European lives and continued to be sung in the New World. Many of the new arrivals came from laboring and farming and servant classes overseas and came to fulfill the burgeoning need for unskilled labor in the colonies as they sought relief from poverty or famine in their homelands. Traditional tunes had been a mainstay for their entertainment, and familiar songs were a source of comfort when homesickness struck. Thus, hundreds of old folk tunes such as Barbara Allen and The Foggy Dew or Scarborough Fair kept a lasting place in the popular repertory. These usually anonymous songs were learned by ear and kept in the collective memory as part of their oral tradition. People enjoyed new songs too, but not everyone was a fan. We've already seen that distaste for, quote, idle, foolish, yea, pernicious songs and ballads had led many ministers to advocate for the establishment of singing schools and regular singing. Cotton Mather noted in his diary with obvious dismay, quote, I am informed that the minds and manners of many people about the country are much corrupted by foolish songs and ballads, which by the hawkers and peddlers carry into all parts of the country. The ballads that Mathers and others disliked were usually songs that narrated some sort of story, normally in strophic form, but sometimes with a recurring refrain. Mathers' mentions of peddlers was a reference to a practice of selling broadsides in which were printed the words of a new ballad. Broadside ballads were inexpensive and were sold just like newspapers, and sometimes ballad texts were also published in newspapers. Broadside ballads almost never included musical notation. Either new melodies were learned by rote or printed words were intended to fit some well-known pre-existing tune. Very similar to the way that numerous metrical psalms texts would all work with a single melody as long as it accommodated the poetry's meter. The simple, often familiar tune was intended to keep the listener's focus on the text. In the colonies, the text began to differ somewhat from traditional British ballads across the Atlantic. British poems seldom mentioned physical labor, but awareness of the hard work of pioneering permeates many of the American songs. Moreover, the subject matter of the British songs was often a bit unreal, as historian Malcolm Laws put it, quote, the characters are frequently finding themselves in tragic situations which people of ordinary sense could have avoided. The American tragic ballad, by contrast, has a certain blunt honesty about it which increases its impact and makes it entirely believable. It sounds factual rather than fictional because it deals in a straightforward manner with realistic subject matter. In many songs, the realism of the subject matter was due to the fact that the song was a news ballad describing an actual occurrence. Richard Crawford notes that the verses of new colonial ballads often served as a means of communication. Their poetry, quote, celebrated historical events, debated political points, poked fun at social practice, and propelled political candidates to victory. Among a rural population, the higher rates of illiteracy than the colonial cities, listening to the broadside ballad text was a useful way of staying abreast current events. Certainly as a song, the performance was entertaining, but in the colonial environment, quote, the ballad singer assumed the role of journalist, delivering a story in a detached manner, uninvolved in the suspense and passions of the unfolding tale, end quote. The oldest known American news ballad, Springfield Mountain, displays many of the characteristics that Laws and others have described. It relates a sad and believable story of Timothy Myrick, 1739 to 1761. The only son of Lieutenant Thomas Myrick, died on Friday, August 7, 1761, after being bitten by a rattlesnake while he was mowing a family meadow at Springfield Mountain, now known as Wilbraham, Massachusetts. The incident was reported in a 1765 almanac issued by Joseph Fisk, in which he reviewed local events from the preceding decade. Fisk had the custom of putting his historical anecdotes into rhyme, rather like the Calvinists' treatment of Psalms. And the following is his almanac summary of the tragic day. At Springfield Mountain there was one, bit by a rattlesnake alone, and this poor man he to death did yield, as he went home died in the field. As he called for help, but none did go, till death did prove his overthrow, and all the jury did agree, his leg was bitten as they could see. Samuel Warner, a resident of Springfield Mountain at the time, maintained his own unofficial town records. His account about young Timothy read, quote, bit by a rattlesnake, one August the 7th, 1761, and died within about 2 or 3 hours, he being 22 years, 2 months, and 3 days old, and very near the point of marriage. The folklorist Philip Berry, a tireless researcher, was able to identify Timothy's fiancée. She was Sarah Lamb, also a Springfield resident, who married another young man a year and a half later. Timothy Myrick's lichen-covered gravestone still sits in Wilbraham Deacon Adams Cemetery, located at Milliwak Corner at the intersection of Tinkham and Main. It reads, here lies ye body of Mr. Timothy Myrick, son of Lieutenant Thomas and Mrs. Mary Myrick, who died August 7th, 1761, in ye 23rd year of his age. This is followed by a quote from Job. He cometh forth like a flower, and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow, and continueth not. The facts of Timothy's passing almost immediately begin to blur as the sung versions started to circulate. The family then became known as Merrick, Merrill, Murray, or sometimes Curtis or Kurtz. Then in the mid-19th century, 2 comedians, George Spear and George Hill, developed a gimmick in their stage entertainments in which they mimicked rural Yankees. They created a comic parody of Springfield Mountain called Love and Pison. That made some substantial changes to the traditional version. They added nonsense syllables and were replaced by many other meaningless syllables over time. The most significant alteration was the addition of a sweetheart, Sally, later called Molly, who attempts to save Timothy by sucking the poison from his wound. But thanks to a cavity in one of her teeth, she ingests poisons as well, and both lovers reach a ludicrous death. Over the years, the song continued to evolve with no known concrete notated original version. Balladeers took liberties, any that they wished, with the text and melody. Still, there are hints that a printed broadside had once existed. Descendants of the Myrick family found a handwritten copy of the lyrics, the poetry for a song, in the elderly relative's desk that opened with the phrase, "Lines written on the death of Timothy Merrick, who was bit by a rattlesnake in the year 1761. The wording, "lines written on the death," was a formulaic opening for many broadsides, suggesting that the relative had copied the words from a printed sheet. Also, a 19th century chronicler commented that the poem had a wide circulation in both manuscript and print, implying that he too had seen printed versions. By the early 1930s, Barry had cataloged 4 primary versions of the ballad, which he called the Myrick type, and Curtis type, and Sally type, the Molly type. The first 2 were serious in nature, while the latter pair was comedic version. Now, nearly a century later, Springfield Mountain has continued to evolve, as we will see in listening example 3. So next time, we'll talk about listening example 3, Springfield Mountain, attributed to Anonymous. So, I'll talk to you next time, and we'll look at a story with a moral.